Deputy Mayor, could you sit down, please? They'll be sore if you don't sit down. Okay, we have a response to Councillor Wayne Walker from our CFO. Peter, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Councillor, and the opportunity to go away and consider it with some legal advice. Given the way the recommendations are currently drafted and the integrated nature of them, in particular the overall CapEx and operating expenditure and how it fits with the general rate, it would be very difficult, nay impossible at this late stage to split them out separately. So apologies for that, but hopefully that's a clear and crisp answer to the question.
Thank you, Peter.
Through you, Madam Chair.
You had other questions? Yes?
Well, just dealing with this particular question, I'm not suggesting that there's any need to split out any financials. My question is around splitting the recommendation as it stands now. My understanding is that the climate change targeted rate is specific, has been specifically costed, and frankly, I really ask the question as to what the purpose of voting is on something if you don't have a choice. So, on my part, I am interested in voting separately on the climate change targeted rate, noting that it is quite distinct from the general rate. Is that possible?
Yes, that can be noted, Councillor. Peter, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I'd just reiterate the integrated nature of this, as I did earlier when I was talking to the credit rating comfort issue.
So am I to understand, Madam Chair, that it is possible to split that recommendation as it stands now, or do I need to move an amendment to that effect?
I think if you look at the recommendations, you could vote against B and note your vote against that.
So
the recommendations, they are actually.
I have read the recommendations. So in an instance where a councillor has a concern around the general rate and they want to record a vote against that and vote on that separately, how are they to do it in respect of the way this is put together? And in my opinion, this is put together almost deliberately to make it difficult to actually achieve any separation. So I have a question there, Madam Chair.
Councillor, if I just make a point, there was a reason why Councillor Simpson and I emailed everybody last week and raised verbally with people last week. If you wanted to have an amendment considered, we needed to have advance notice of that so that we could work out whether it was possible to put that amendment without undermining the fundamental integrity of the budget. And if you'd been able to do that, we could have given a little more thought to what you were after. We cannot do that at this stage, but what you can do, as has always been the case, is note your opposition to a particular thing. I'm not quite sure from what you're saying whether you're against the targeted rate or against the general rate, but you can ask to note your opposition to such and such, and that will be recorded.
Okay, I don't agree with that, but I'll move on to some questions. In respect of the climate action targeted rate, can you tell me what the consequence is in reduction in emissions? That is, what does it actually do to reducing emissions in terms of the amount of emissions? Because that information is not in the agenda, and I would have thought it was fundamental to this budget.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go at that, and Matt Blakey might also like to address it. The direct impact of the specific initiatives will be on estimates to reduce emissions by about 47,000 tonnes, but that doesn't take into account this being part of a coordinated effort and also being part of laying the foundation to achieve mode shift. You'll recall, Councillor, that when we went through this many times in our workshops, the consistent advice was that the best way to reduce emissions is to achieve mode shift. You can only achieve mode shift if you have a mode to shift to. And if we do not have the increased bus services that are the main feature of this package, then you will never get the carbon emissions down because people won't have the alternative that they can opt for and leave their car in the garage. This will build over time, and it will build in conjunction with a range of other measures, including the congestion charge, to produce an effect that will actually magnify the reduction of emissions over time. But until you lay the foundation to build on, then you can't build the edifice that you need that will have the level of impact on carbon emissions that we need to have to achieve our target. But we are working on advice from officials here, and the advice that they gave us was that this was the most effective way to begin the process of pulling those emissions down, and what we could do most quickly that would have the greatest effect. But I'm going to pass across to Matthew to further on that answer.
Matthew.
Tēnā koutou katoa, through the chair. Mayor Goff has just provided an excellent explanation there in terms of the emissions reduction context of the climate action targeted rate. I'll just add a little bit further to that. So firstly, it's worth noting that international, national and regional research and analysis all point towards the need to significantly reduce transport emissions. This includes the IPCC report on climate change mitigation published in April this year, the Climate Change Commission's advice to government, Hikina Te Kuapara, the Ministry of Transport's Green Paper on emissions reduction pathways, the emissions reduction plan published by government, and of course the Tarakia Tawhiri, Auckland's climate plan that was developed over 2 years with engagement with stakeholders, including those in Auckland and central government. So we have firm direction, we have direction from a range of leading sources that a focus should be on significant mode shift to public transport and active modes, walking and cycling, to enable us to transition to a low carbon transport system. Taking that into consideration, I just want to highlight some of the challenges of estimating emissions from the transport system. The transport system is complex in nature. It involves many variables and many uncertainties, including, for example, behaviour change, which is a critical component. When we consider transport, we have to consider transport as a system. It's not as straightforward as measuring the emissions reduction from, for example, switching out a gas boiler for a heat pump. It's not about fuel switch here, it's about transitioning a system and transitioning the way people travel and how people access certain destinations. So with that in mind, we need to consider that the climate action targeted rate, it's part of a bigger picture around emissions reduction, and there's many different elements to this that are all complementing the climate action targeted rate, including the government's emissions reduction plan, including strategies that we have around urban intensification and bringing people closer to areas they wish to access. One of the things to note is that it's not feasible to accurately estimate emissions reductions from the transport system in any way that provides certainty. To provide false certainty, I believe, is not helpful. It may be seductive in nature in terms of having that false certainty, but what we really need to consider is the opportunity to reduce emissions reduction. And that is all of the evidence is pointing towards the need to focus on transport. We did use the Auckland Forecasting Centre's macro strategic model to consider the emissions reductions from this package. It is worth noting that the Auckland Forecasting Centre's transport model is a model used to estimate and model traffic in terms of it's a traffic forecasting model. It has not been designed to model transport emissions reductions specifically. Therefore, the model we're using has not been designed for this purpose. The emissions reductions from that model are available. They were shared with everyone here at a workshop last year. They were also in the media in February. So 47,000 tonnes of CO2 over 10 years, 12,000 tonnes of CO2 a year at 2032. They are not significant amounts, but they need to be considered in the context of a broader change. They are amounts that have been modelled based on current assumptions around the transport system without additional interventions, additional changes to the transport system. So with that, I share those numbers with you, but I'm very confident, as we all are on this team, that those figures will be greatly exceeded by the change that we have ahead of us.
Can I just ask a supplementary to that, please, Matthew? I mean, in your advice and the advice of the experts that you've consulted with, is what we are recommending here the best way, in your opinion, to actually reduce our carbon emissions?
Everything is pointing towards the need for us to focus on transport, and in particular, a mode shift to public transport, active transport, that being walking and cycling, to enable a reduction in transport emissions in Auckland. And it also, all the evidence is also pointing towards the need to do that to enable a more equitable transition to a low carbon future, recognising that carbon costs are set to increase. We're already seeing that in terms of fuel prices. That pattern is set to increase. So we're very much thinking about how we can drive an equitable transition through this package as well.
Thank you.
So a supplementary question for Matthew, Madam Chair. How quickly do we start getting emissions reductions, Matthew, based on this climate action targeted rate? When do things start kicking in?
So through the chair, as you'll recall, Councillor, one of the 4 criteria for the climate action targeted rate is that these projects can be started fast. So therefore, we've focused on projects that don't require extensive planning, don't require extensive construction. We are looking at projects that can be started quickly. With that in mind, some of the projects will require the time it takes to, for example, train new bus drivers, procure new buses, and build new infrastructure, whether that be walking and cycling. But certainly, we are looking within the next year to 18 months to have these emissions reductions being realised. And we're looking at the frequent transit network that has been identified as a result of the climate action targeted rate being implemented by 2027.
So just further to that, I mean, can you clarify that most of these bus services, these new bus services, are some years out?
They are not some years out. They will be in place within the next few years. The transport strategy team are also here online and can certainly clarify specifics there. And I'll just pause there in case they wish to join and add the further information on the sequencing of bus services.
Hi there. Thank you, Matt. It's Robert Simpson here from the Transport Strategy team. Yes, that's right. There is a phased introduction of bus services ramping up to full implementation by year 5 of the targeted rate. But the improvements start from year 2. So as Matt says, that's partly due to the need for the bus operators to ramp up their capacity to be able to deliver these improvements. But of course, it's also partly due to the fact that the revenue from the targeted rate doesn't all come at once. It's phased in over a number of years. Thank you.
Okay, supplementary question, Madam Chair. In order to effect this change to mode shift, is there any budget in the climate action targeted rate for behavioural change? Thank you.
Through the chair, yes, there is budget incorporated into the climate action targeted rate to enable behaviour change for the transport elements. It is important to note that the climate action targeted rate is focused on delivering the services that we need to enable mode shift, but of course behaviour change goes hand in hand with that, and we need to ensure that behaviour change occurs to enable and promote the shift that is required. So yes, in short, there is funding within the climate action targeted rate proposal to fund behaviour change initiatives to support the additional services.
Thank you. I've got a further question that the Mayor or someone in Finance might be able to answer, Madam Chair. And I just wanted to seek confirmation that in addition to the climate action targeted rate, we still have the water quality targeted rate and the natural environment targeted rate. And I did have a question just around where the accommodation provided targeted rate is at. Thank you, Madam Chair. And in addition to that, question,
before
yes,
you
just
go on to your next question.
Well, it's just a bolt on. If it is the case that those targeted rates are already in place, are they subject also to the 3.5% increase? Thank you.
Only the water quality targeted rate is subject to the 3.5%. Council voted on that last year, as I recall, and there was overwhelming support for that. It was unanimous, in fact. So, Councillor, I think you probably supported it as well. With the water quality targeted rate, again, that's affected by three waters. And if Healthy Waters transfers to the new water services entity, that targeted rate will go, and the new water services entity will raise that money directly through some form of water rate. We don't know precisely how that will work, but the water quality targeted rate, council rate, is to provide for activities provided by council, and that activity would move beyond council. So that rate would not be in its current form if Three Waters proceeds. On the natural environment targeted rate, again, I understood that there was probably near unanimous support for that from councillors who really wanted to do something about kauri dieback. I remember the debates we had on that about predator control. Some really good news about kokako in the hunuas have increased from about 20 a couple of decades ago to probably, I think it's 400, Councillor Hills, now. 229, I'm exaggerating. It's a tenfold increase, so that's breeding pairs. Oh, so you double that, you've got the 400, so I was partly right. And in terms of the accommodation provider targeted rate, that's subject to an appeal to the Supreme Court. You'll remember we won decisively at the High Court, reversed by the Appeal Court. External legal advice to our Chief Executive said that this should be challenged to the Supreme Court, and Council has made that decision, not elected representatives, but council officers. And we won't know the answer to that until such time as the Supreme Court has heard that case. And we shouldn't comment on it while the Supreme Court is hearing the case.
All right, Councillor.
Yes, Madam Chair. Reserve my right to speak later. Thank you.
Yes. I've also had a response from legal, and it goes to the to your vote on the general rate or the climate action targeted rate. And that advice is if someone wanted to vote against the general rates increase or the climate action targeted rate, they would need to vote against resolution A or vote in favour and have noted in the minutes the opposition to a certain aspect of A. Thank you. Next question from Councillor
Thank you, Madam
Darby.
Chair.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for accepting late questions over the weekend, in fact, last night, and having them responded to. Thanks, Chief Financial Officer. And look, most of those are satisfied. But I just want to explore just one area. On the table under the scenario of a $250 million deferral package, it originally included a 15% reduction in the Urban Cycleway program, and that now has struck out and is in the spend, so there's no deferrals in that. That's good. I was intrigued to drill down into the detail of a project that's very close to Councillor Hills and I, and that is the Lake Road proposal, and it's been suggested as a deferral, but I've discovered that it's actually only a 20% per annum of the total budget allocation for the next 3 years, which is deferred. It's a resequencing more than a deferral, which is actually quite minor, which I'm relieved to understand now. Does that apply to a number of the other so-called deferrals, that they're actually resequencings along a sort of at a similar scale of 20%. The project is kept alive. Is it Promod?
Yeah,
Promod's
while Promod is coming up, it's going to be difficult to give you a blanket answer for that because it's case specific. We took a fair degree of reprioritisation of the capital and delivery aspects into the budget refresh prior to the CapEx scenarios that we've pulled together. But Promod may be able to add some greater meat to that skeleton.
Through you, Madam Chair. So, Councillor David, just to be clear, in a lot of the cases, and this is at a high level, because I haven't got the detail line by line, where deferrals are proposed, it doesn't necessarily mean that the project is stopping. In line with what you've been advised of for the Lake Road project, it is some rephasing. The projects do continue. Some may be at detailed design or scoping phase, and those projects can still continue through those stages. And once delivery timeframes are confirmed as we progress, because it's actually large multi-year projects, the budgets can be rephased to align with actual delivery. So,
okay, look, I'm relieved that it was just a clarification I needed. That project, dear to us, is online. It's on target to be completed in the year that was already intended to be completed, and just a small 20% per annum for the next 3 years. Look, the other question that did throw up, and a further question, was the Coast Guard recommendation of 750k. Now, I did ask the CFO overnight whether Coast Guard, when they amalgamated into a national body, whether all those in governance and senior management were totally aware that upon amalgamation, they were not eligible to a RAFA funding. The answer was yes, they were totally aware, but they still knocked on the door anyway, and we're subject to today bowed to their request and offered 750k. I'm mindful of the chief executive always telling us sometimes you just have to stop doing things. I'm looking at that, and did we ever ask Coast Guard what the implications are? They've got amalgamated budgets now. What is the implication of Auckland Council not contributing 750? Does that mean the national budget will not be fairly apportioned over the national needs? Have they indicated that Auckland services for Coast Guard would be to the detriment of $750,000 equivalent in value, Peter?
Thank you for the councillor question. Councillor. I'm trying to call for help. But I can confirm that everyone was aware at the time 2 years ago that the funding was ceasing due to the Coast Guard being part there of its national body. So that is indeed accurate. The degree to which services are impacted, we have heard that regional education services and the KPI there may be unable to be delivered with this level of funding, and that would certainly mean implications for the Auckland region. I'm not sure if anyone online has anything further to add to that in terms of specificity, in particular Alistair Cameron.
Look, in the interest of time, I don't think I'll take that one any further. I can see, and it has been confirmed, that the national body was fully aware of the implications at the time, yet they still knocked on the door. So just in terms of something that does annoy me a little bit when we do grant money, that we are acknowledged as a sponsor or a partner. The Auckland Coast Guard website contains no acknowledgement of Auckland Council's significant funding. If this was to proceed today, I would hope that we don't need to do this by amendment, Mr. Mayor. I would hope that our staff insist on acknowledgement of Auckland Council's financial partnership and make it very clear on their website and communications that we're a significant funder, subject to the decision coming up.
Yeah. Councillor, I absolutely agree with that. That when we fund an organisation, it should be acknowledged on their website. And that's just common sense, really, and I'm surprised that hasn't happened. Just on the earlier question, Ed Siddle is the person that's been dealing directly with this. When Auckland Coast Guard became part of the New Zealand scene, they were told that they were no longer eligible for ARAFA funding, but funding was provided separately. We made the saving out of ARAFA. Funding was provided separately to Coast Guard for 2 years. What I wasn't able to find out was whether they had been told definitively that that would be the end of their funding, or whether there was an expectation, not contradicted, that they would continue to get funding. I was advised, and I think the chair of the committee was advised in correspondence from Coast Guard, that some critical emergency services that were delivered for Aucklanders would be lost if the funding was not payable. The funding this year provides us, it's for a year, and it provides us the opportunity to run through the extent to which Auckland Council is a necessary funder in order to ensure that those emergency services are available for Aucklanders. What I didn't want to take the risk of was suddenly finding that and they are vital services for Aucklanders, it's not called the City of Sales for no reason, that those services suddenly would be lost and a vacuum left. I wasn't prepared to run that risk, so I suggested to our officers that the funding be extended for a year and that we use that year to work through the precise nature of what is being funded and whether our funding continues to be essential for the provision of those essential services. And that, I think, was the appropriate course to take. But it is funding for 1 year while the work is done that I would have hoped might have been done over the last 2 years when the funding was provided separately from ARAFA. So your questions are fair questions, and council officers will be looking to get answers on those questions from Coast Guard.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mayor.
Just further to that, Councillor, I'm just adding another few words to the recommendation around that. Thank you. I think you raised a really good point. And it's not a chair's recommendation because these are being moved by the mayor and the deputy mayor, but the chair will put it in anyway. I'm sure you'll agree, won't you, Mr. Mayor? Thank you. Just hold that line. Councillor Hills, next question from you. Thanks.
Good, Chair. Thank you. Just on the climate action targeted rate, just to you, the mayor. Considering the unanimous support for Te Tarakia Tāwhiri climate plan and the mode shift targets in there, have you had any other requests from anyone around this table or virtually of a different way to get these or get the direction, apart from doubling it or tripling it, to get to the sorts of targets we need to get to?
The short answer to that is no. We workshopped this over, gosh, I don't know how many separate meetings we had specifically on climate action targeted rate. And Matthew and his team took us through that very thoroughly. The recommendations were made on the basis of the 4 principles that were set out, and the recommendations were on the best advice that our people who are expert in council in this area could give us as to what would produce the best impact, the most effective impact on climate change. But unless I missed it, I'm not aware of alternative options that were put up during that workshopping proposal for how we should alternatively be spending that money. The proposals are very specific, and it's important that the public had specific proposals. Every one of us know exactly how that money is going to be spent on buses, on walkways, pedestrian crossings, cycleways, emissions reduction for ferries, emission reduction for buses by having electric buses, electric and hybrid ferries, and by greater urban coverage, forest coverage for areas that are disadvantaged. I don't personally recall that alternative options were put up.
Thank you. And just checking on the electric ferries and the electric buses, are the electric buses over and above what we funded last year in the climate initiatives, and are the ferries over and above what the government has announced in their package for Auckland?
Yeah, just to take the latter first, the government very kindly is funding the first two conversions to electric ferries, but we have, I think, 13 ferries, and we're looking in this package to help convert another 6 to 7 ferries. And why the emphasis on ferries is that ferries actually produce 21% of the carbon emissions of our public transport fleet. That's really important. The additional buses being converted, yeah, they're being converted on the basis that this funding will be available. It will bring forward those conversions. This council said in an earlier budget that we would not be procuring any new diesel buses from 2021, and I think we're one of the avant-garde cities to actually do that. But there's a very, very big bus fleet, and the more money we can get, the more money we can use to bring forward the removal of our diesel belching buses to clean buses. And there is some provision that the government has made in their emissions reduction scheme, but not a huge provision that may help. Maybe Auckland will get another 10 or 20 bus conversions out of that. But without this money, those conversions could not happen. And that's true of the budget as a whole. If you don't have the money, you can pass every resolution you like about what an emergency we're in facing climate change. But if you're not prepared to act to change the emissions, then actually the resolutions don't mean a hell of a lot at all, and the public understand that.
Thank you. And with the 350 million announced, it's a 2-year funding from the government on the emissions reduction plan. Is it my understanding that they're working with the team on this proposal plus our other plans to kind of zip those together to enable more earlier?
Yeah, discussions are going on. The government made the high-level announcements, and what our team is now doing is working out how Auckland Council can get access to that to bring forward some of our plans for emissions reduction. And of course, because of the pressures on the National Land Transport Fund, we did not budget for government funding for the first 4 years. But with these changes, we can get stuff done that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. And as I mentioned, I think in my opening comments, we have an advantage over others because the Minister's office has made it very clear. If you're showing that you're willing to co-fund stuff and you've got a plan to use the money, you'll get priority. And absolutely, we're looking for priority because we are willing to co-fund and we are ready to take decisive action to reduce emissions, and that gives us a leading edge.
Thank you, Chair. I have 3 questions quick for finance. I don't know who wants to answer those, Chair. The first one is on, and we get a lot of discussion around debt and why we're still borrowing and et cetera, et cetera. If we were to not borrow for the capital we're doing this year and to simply pay for it through cash from rates, what would we have to put up the rates by this year to enable the capital we're doing this year?
900 divided by 18.
So if we go for around $900 million worth of capital expenditure and divide that by the $20 million per percent of rates, I think that comes to quickly around 45% increase in rates.
So if we weren't borrowing for the capital for intergenerational payback, essentially, we would have to put up the rates around 50% this year or stop the capital spend completely.
As always, you're having to achieve a balanced budget. So yes, if you wanted to still fund the capital and you didn't want to do it from borrowings, that would probably be the only way you could go.
Okay, thank you. On the reduction, which is higher than we thought, the 175, is it? 185, the revenue gap from COVID largely. What is that? What would that be if we didn't do the asset cycle, we didn't do the savings, we didn't, etc. If it was on rates, what was the...
I know that. I just don't know the
answer. No, I'm afraid I'd have to we'd have to specify which elements of the current balanced program were not to be achieved. So we've got 70 million, for instance, in there of asset recycling. We have a target of 90 million ongoing, and we consulted on 15, then 30. We're now talking about an ongoing gap of 90 to 150. So it's very difficult to give you a specific answer to that, which is why in the staff presentation we've got the 3 or 4 levers that work as a mix to provide the solution to the gap across capital deferrals with the 3 scenarios, against future rates with a number of scenarios there, and around service reductions and operational savings as the other element in it. But I can't give you a point estimate on that one because it depends which of the 3 levers are still in play.
But essentially, if we didn't have to make those hard calls, the rates would go up considerably if we were just going to go from rates.
That is, if the other levers aren't used, rates is the lever that's left. Of course, within the current consultation, that's not an option, so it is for the future.
Okay. And maybe the last question for the Mayor, and I had a similar concern to Councillor Henderson. I'm very opposed to delaying capital because of the future cost of that same capital to do. We are making what is a decision to defer, but essentially we keep getting told that it's actually not necessarily in our control. So do we have to make the decision to defer, or could we essentially put that we are unable to complete this capital? My understanding is it's largely to do with the ability of staff, supply chain, etc., that these delays to capital will happen. It's not us choosing. If we could do it, we probably would do it.
It's a combination of those things. As Peter has just pointed out, if you take away any lever as a way of raising funding, then you have to put more pressure on the other levers. And I don't think councillors want to put intense pressure on the public in terms of rate increases that are unaffordable. At the same time, I mean, the other option, of course, which is a Ratepayers Alliance option, is that you don't do anything and you watch the gradual disintegration of the infrastructure and the failure of your city. That's not being dramatic. That's what's happened all over the United States in the past. If we don't invest in the things that we need, then the infrastructure and also the glue that holds your city together is lost. With the deferred capital, as I said, I've chosen the least impactful of the options, which only saves a relatively small amount of money, and is in conjunction with the fact that, you know, I thought that construction would start to slow at the moment with higher interest rates, etc. I got the figures for the latest building consents, and they show that we were, in April, 9 houses off the all-time record for the most houses ever consented in April. And if you look at the graph, it's just kept going up. That's put huge pressure on the construction industry, on skilled labour, on supplies of materials, and worsened by the supply chain problems created by COVID. So it makes sense at the moment to consider some small deferrals of construction projects that won't have dramatically bad effects, won't affect high-risk projects, just to do a little bit of that, and that's what's being proposed. In the next year, it'll be 30 million, and if circumstances change dramatically and there are alternatives, then Council, in the budget for 23-24, which you'll be looking at by December of this year, we'll be able to revisit it. But it's important to keep it there as one extra thing we can do while looking at a minimalist impact on the impact of projects, as Councillor Darby quite correctly pointed out, will have a minor effect. I think one of the community centres, there is a deferral there, but the finishing date is still going to be the same. It's just that the funding will go into it in a different sequence. So I think it's smart to use that, provided you're not having a dramatically bad effect by delaying that construction.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Question now from Councillor Filipaina.
Tēnā koe e he mana Desli, tēnā koe. Tēnā koe te rangatira e koro matua. Ngā mihi ki a koe. Tēnā koe te katoa e kai mahi e kai ni here o tāmaki makaurau. Your Worship, I just wanted to sort of cover off on the earlier question from Councillor Henderson, and that is in regards to the local board decision making. Having looked through your proposal, there's obviously not a specific item that you have in your recommendations, but where will I be able to vote against that particular one, or even under little b and the Roman numerals, Your Worship? Also, Chair, I reserve my right to speak in regards to why, as I indicated at the workshop. So, kia ora.
Kia ora, Councillor. What we heard at the workshop was that the funding for this proposal is already built into the baselines. So it's not a case of having to put the money in. It would require an amendment to take the money out. And, I'm keen on finding any way of saving money, but I listened to the discussion around the table and acknowledged the fact that there have been a range of different studies that have promoted the solution that the governing body accepted last year, and in the end decided that from a personal point of view, I didn't think standing in the way of that extra expenditure that was already in the budget was justified, given the overall outcome of the framework review. I think, but I might be subject to correction on this, that we are looking at the government framework review paper on the 23rd of this month. So there may be a chance at a later date for you to raise a more specific recommendation on that. But it remains open to you or anybody else if you wanted to take money out of the budget. I don't usually encourage that to happen, either put money in or take it out, because there's an integrity to the budget package, but you would be able to move that way, or you could wait till we have the specific discussion on the governance framework review on the 23rd of June.
Kia ora, Your Worship, and just a clarification. So can I confirm that what you've just said is that the money is in there and approved, or has it been indicated and tabled and has not as yet been approved, and that is the $8 million over the 3-year period? Just question of clarification.
Yeah, we approved funding it in the paper that went to governing body last year, but like everything else, every proposal, funding proposal for the coming year is part of the budget proposal. But we actually, and this is one thing that I suppose that influenced my view on this, we have actually made the decision to adopt and fund the government framework review paper, which we did, I haven't got the date in front of me, but it was at a governing body last year. October the 28th last year. So we would have to, in effect, we'd have to reverse the decision that we've already made, and we'd have to take the money out of the budget. It's not a case of finding new money to put into it to fund the framework review.
Kia ora, thank you. Kia ora, Desley.
Thank you, Marta Alf. So I have just calling for no more questions. I will now then take a 5-minute break and go to comments. Thank you.